Alright, I thought I would describe Tom Bombadil, actually. I know what Tom Bombadil is now. It just struck me, and I was like, oh yeah, that's obviously what it represents. Um, Tom Bombadil is the embodiment of God's providence. Like, everything about Tom Bombadil is basically God's providence. Um, like, he's a miracle. He's a walking miracle that refreshes the soul and saves you from things that no one else can. That is the essence of what God's providence actually is. Like, it's the purest embodiment of God's providence in human character form that I've ever seen in my life. And that's why it took so long for people to know what it is, and why I figured it out. Because Tolkien left it, and he didn't understand it because he hasn't experienced God's providence necessarily in a way that like came forefront to his mind or something. I know that there's a story before Lord of the Rings with him in it, but his position in Lord of the Rings specifically is as God's providence in a body. He's the embodiment of God's providence. That's why he's in the story. He's not just a mystery in the sense of like nobody can know anything about him. That's why people guess he's Eru Ilúvatar in human form, or like he's like a one of those things that existed before Eru Ilúvatar created the universe and so on. And it's like if you look at the concept of God's providence, like there's elements of all these different theories about Tom Bombadil that line up all of a sudden in one way with God, with it being the embodiment of God's providence in a human character. As for the other characters, I'll start with Pippin and Merry. Actually, no, I'll start with Legolas and Gimli and work my way towards more hobbits and so on. Legolas is the finesse-driven, elegant person, and Gimli is the tough, gruff character of people in those directions. Boromir is the redemptive sacrifice. Aragorn is the successful sacrifice to new heights. Pippin is successful resistance and exposure to malevolent dominance with his Palantir. And like if you notice, Pippin is constantly being taken care of in some sense, and he kind of doesn't do anything fighting wise. So like everyone's taking care of Pippin basically. And Merry is the exposure to malevolent will to extermination. The Nazgul representing death, basically. Sam, Frodo, and Gollum sort of represent, in a way, a Freudian trio. There's also analysis that Sam is a faithful servant, kind of like what Tolkien recognized in soldiers when he was an officer in World War One. Gollum is also kind of a creature of addiction and so on, which is a very Christian passions and lower base desires and addiction, basically. So there's an element of there, and that's correlated with the id to some extent. Sam is the ego, and Frodo is the superego. And then when you get into like Jesus Christ being the superego and so on, you start getting into Frodo being the priest part of Jesus, and Gandalf is the prophet part of Jesus, and Aragorn is the king part of Jesus. Now, Gandalf is also a very right-brain kind of intellectual in a coded way, but he's also the aged elder sacrificing himself for the sake of the future generations. Saruman is the left brain mechanical mind run amok, unconstrained by other like broader considerations in method. Very using and tool oriented and not respectful of other people as people. Grima Wormtongue is the influential poison of the soul, and Eomer is the helpless good servant who requires outside help to see to it that his kingdom survives and thrives. Whereas Grima is talking of alliances and stuff like that with people who wish ill upon you. There's also Elrond, who is like the wise king in decline, and he's sort of the Osiris figure, as per Jordan Peterson's description of Osiris, Set, and Horus, and Isis. Sauron is Set, basically. What else? The journey from the Shire is childhood, and the journey to Rivendell is like teenage, young adult, and the journey to Rohan is middle age, and the journey to Gondor is old age. Mordor is all things death and decay and domination. And then they travel back to the Shire, and they see the old home with new eyes. And the scouring of the Shire is the cleansing of the old home of its problems that have grown because no one was rising to the occasion to solve them. Because they're children. So the return to the Shire is the healing your wounded inner child in some sense. And the Grey Havens are when you're super old and you're ready to move to the next stage, the next phase of whatever happens after you die. Then there's Treebeard. Finally, Treebeard. Actually, no, there's a few more. Treebeard is a Salt of the Earth Elder. They're not changing the world particularly much. They're changing the world in small ways with their insight and so on. So they're not like a world-shattering intellectual with the brightest new ideas, but they just have a lot of experience with the day-to-day little things and so on. They maintain the normal world and so on. As elders, they're not called to heroic, noble sacrifices of their lives. They're not ruling the nations. They're not um, changing the zeitgeist of the world. They're just solving the day to day life problems, and that's like their domain. Um, then you get to Arwen, Eowyn, and Galadriel. And Arwen is the. How do I put this? Eowyn is the young woman. Arwen is the maybe the woman in her 30s or 25 years old or something, whereas Eowyn is like 15 to 20 in terms of like the representation of like a typical female's age. And Galadriel is like the 40-year-old. Um, in a way. Like that's kind of like the rough position these people take and so on, relative to the thing from my limited experience with women and how they behave and what they think and so on. Um, so yeah. And basically you have Eowyn and Eomer, you have Arwen and Aragorn, and then you have Galadriel and Celeborn, or as the elves put it, Teleporn. Now, Celeborn is a little different. Celeborn is kind of like the husband in the situation of the house. When you invite company over and the woman's doing all the talking and so on. It's like he's like the husband when he's supporting her wife in doing what she's good at and what she's supposed to be responsible for. Like Celeborn and Galadriel are sort of like the approach you should have to the neighborhood's kids when you're adults and have a family. Um, yeah. Um, I mean, they've already done analysis of like the Grey Havens and like what that represents in aging and death and so on. But that's my character breakdown of like the various representations of people and so on, and what they're responsible for, and like what they're good for, and what they represent, and so on and so on. Sauron is primarily the only evil one through and through, as well as the Nazgul, um, and the Balrog. Um, of these characters that I'm describing, basically, and I forgot to mention the Balrog, but basically the Balrog is like warfare, basically. Um, like the Balrog is basically the experience of warfare and so on. And the Nazgul and Sauron are more like the essence or spirit of the spirit of domination and malevolence, or the spirit of malevolent will to exterminate, respectively. Whereas the Balrog is more general warfare as a general experience. Um, Yeah, yeah. That's how I describe it.